Goeienaand, good evening. After that very impressive bio, I have performance anxiety. Maybe one thing that I can mention, I always like to find some kind of a connection point with an audience. And I think with this one, I can say I studied meteorology at Tukkies. So I also hung around the engineering faculty for a while with engineers, but that's about as close as I came. Tonight was a bit of a challenge for me because normally I teach on complexity. And I was really racking my brain, how do I make complexity interesting in a gala dinner context? Because it's not the lightest of topics. So I really hope that I was successful in that. Maybe just to start off with, when I say complexity, I'm very aware that there are different definitions of complexity. You know, I saw on that one poster over there as well that you designed and optimized complex business systems. And I find sometimes what happens is that just because of the common use of these terms, when people talk about complexity, we don't necessarily speak about the same thing. So for tonight, when I refer to complexity, I'm referring to what they call the science of uncertainty. So I'm going to speak to you about complex adaptive systems. And I think very often the confusion comes in when people, when we talk about complexity in the normal use of the term, we would say, I have to solve a complex maths problem. And actually what we mean is it's complicated. Most people, when they talk about something being chaotic, so we feel like we're in chaos, that would be closer to our term, or what we mean by the term being in a complex adaptive system. So I think if we can just have that kind of a definition in mind that I'm speaking about the science of uncertainty, so maybe what that should have read was leading in uncertainty. And I think, I don't know about you guys, but uncertainty definitely seems to be something that we need to make peace with. I often say to people, we need to befriend uncertainty because it's definitely not going away, and it seems to be increasing. So a while ago, I wrote a blog post on LinkedIn that got quite an interesting response. And that was the title, "It's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo." And it seemed to resonate pretty widely. And I got a very mixed response. And I often get myself in trouble because I like to say that, the typical MBA nowadays actually gets you into trouble in the real business world. Because it teaches you in a very good way how to function in a very predictable and a certain environment in an ordered system. But it doesn't really help you when you are in uncertainty or in a complex system. So in the jungle, so to speak. And this just represents two very different mindsets. There's the mindset of where we assume predictability, certainty, where we can design, where we can optimize. And then there's also this mindset of assuming that things are not as predictable as we think, that we may need to experiment a little bit and that we can't really design ideal solutions. And I think the one thing that I need to say is this is not about one being better than the other or about it being good or bad. It's basically just different. So the metaphor, the analogy that I'd like to use here is just the light spectrum. So we see visible light is just a very small part of that spectrum. We can't see infrared, we can't see ultraviolet, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. And one is not better than the other one. It just gives you a different perspective of a different way of viewing the world. You see different things based on the light spectrum. So for me, it's about seeing differently and basically cultivating what we're calling nowadays contextual intelligence. I don't know how many of you have come across that term, but it's the idea of understanding that one size does not fit all. Not all contexts are the same. Some of the methods that work really well in one context does not serve you in another. And that is the idea that I'd like to just bring across today. And I'm going to assume that you guys are very familiar with ordered contexts. I think you know a lot more than I do about those contexts. So I'm going to spend more of my time tonight just in trying to give you a perspective of what do we do when we find ourselves in uncertainty that might at times feel completely overwhelming to us. So sometimes mechanistic, deterministic, and reductionist thinking is not useful. And the story that I like to share here, and this is where I'm starting to make the distinction between what I mean when I refer to a complicated system versus a complex system. So if you take a Boeing, for example, this is a very complicated system. If it breaks, and the mechanic walks up to that Boeing with his little toolbox, he can take the Boeing apart, he can optimize the different parts, he can fix what is wrong. If he doesn't finish in a day, he can leave, he can walk out the hangar doors, come back again. Nothing has changed on that airplane. It hasn't suddenly adapted and gotten any new problems while he was away. What happens in a large corporate organization when a McKinsey or an Alexander Bain consultant walks through the front door with his little toolbox and the rumors of restructuring starts floating around? Everything changes. That is one thing that's very disconcerting about a complex system, is even just looking at it changes it. In that sense, you are never an objective observer to a complex system. The moment you start interacting with it, it starts changing and adapting. So these are learning systems. I think one of the key things that really makes people uncomfortable is this idea that you can't reduce it to the sum of its parts. These systems are what we call emergent. So Professor Paul Sillier, I don't know how many of you are aware of him, he was a philosopher at the University of Stellenbosch. He passed away a few years ago, but he was a world-renowned complexity thinker. And he always used to use the analogy that complexity is like mayonnaise. So once you've mixed those ingredients, you can't take it apart again. And the mayonnaise does not taste like any of the constituent ingredients. It's got emergent properties. So in that sense, you can't really optimize a complex system in the way that you can optimize a complicated system, by reducing it to its parts and optimizing the individual parts. The other interesting thing, referring to deterministic, which is basically a causal system, is that complex systems aren't causal in the way that we understand them to be. So we're very used to the idea, the typical Newtonian physics idea that every action has an opposite and equal reaction. Now I'm in dangerous territory, I must now be careful. In a complex system, something really small can have a really, really big impact. So I do a lot of work in corporates, and I always find it fascinating. I don't know how many of you remember a couple of years ago, SAIIE had a very disgruntled customer who put up a big billboard about how bad SAIIE is. One disgruntled customer can sink your brand. It's always interesting. It's this idea of the butterfly effect that comes from chaos theory. But on the other hand, I think the interesting thing is we can also leverage that. So sometimes if we want to create a big change in a complex system, small local changes can create big effects. Because also in a complex system, everything is interconnected. So these systems, I think it makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't really fit with all of our science and all of our techniques. But the thing is that they're not new. They're not, anybody who has teenagers, who's raised kids, understand complexity. Every time you drive on the South African roads, you are dealing with complexity. So this is not new. I think the interesting thing for me is just it seems that when people step over the threshold of the workplace, all of a sudden they imagine themselves to be in this wonderfully predictable, complicated environment, and that complexity doesn't exist. But I think that's, unfortunately, my message tonight is that's not true. Wherever there are human beings, there is complexity. So jungles or complex systems in this instance require different skills and different ways of being. And I think one thing that we must realize is that we always basically stand with one foot in a complicated system and the others in a complex system. These systems aren't, you always have a mix of them. That's this idea of, you said you're interested in the wicked problems. These intractable problems, they always involve both complicated systems and complex systems. And for those of you who does, process re-engineering and lean manufacturing and all of these things, don't you just wish sometimes that you could remove the human beings from the equation? Because that's typically where the complexity comes in. Because people have intentionality, they have multiple identities, and they've got intelligence. So in a sense, I'm standing here now as a speaker. When I walk out the door, I'm wife. When I get behind the steering wheel of my car, I'm a driver. When I get home, I'm the foster parent to a 12-week-old puppy. And you, in a sense, never really know who you're dealing with. So even in a corporate context, you don't know what identity you're dealing with, because you don't know if this leader who just walked past you in the hallway and didn't greet you is being rude, or if he's in the identity of father with a sick child at home. So in that sense, human beings are inherently unpredictable. So what are some of these skills? One is to be present and situationally aware. And I think very often in business, when we start thinking about strategies and designing systems, we're very much in the future, and we like to think about what is the ideal. But sometimes within a complex system specifically, the only thing that we really have control over is what is happening in the present moment. And I think very often we are not in the present. And you'll see that the metaphor or the image that I've put in the back there is of a jazz orchestra. And I like to use that metaphor because if you think about a jazz band, or even if you think about a rugby team for argument's sake, both of those are complex systems. You need to be in the present moment. If you think of a jazz band that's improvising, I am not able to respond to the idea that a fellow musician put on the table if I'm not present in the moment. I think the same is true with a complex system. Because they are adaptive, so I always get myself in trouble with OD practitioners as well, because the idea of doing a culture survey. So I'm doing a culture audit now in this company, and I get the results 6 months later. By that time, the culture has completely changed. So in a sense, all you really have in a complex system is the now. And that is a very different paradigm when we're used to designing for the ideal future. So that's the one. Then the second is we need to ensure a requisite diversity. This is also quite different because we tend to manage for homogeneity, because things are so much simpler when they're the same. If everybody can just be the same, it just makes things so much easier. So again, you'll find in many of my clients, when it comes to culture, you'll find that now I must be careful and not name names, but we are going to be the one, what name can I use? The one company. We shall be one. There is the company way, and we will all align to that. And the idea there is to remove diversity, although we say that we want diversity. And I don't know how many of you have worked in organizations where you feel that we're stuck in the status quo, we want some innovation. We need to hire different people. So then you hire those people who think differently, and what happens? When they're in the company, you suddenly realize we don't really want them. Yeah. And they get assimilated. I don't know how many of you watch Star Trek. They get assimilated, like into the Borg. And all of a sudden, they just start thinking like everybody else is thinking. And I always get really sad from a diversity perspective when in most organizations now with BEE, etc., it's become a compliance exercise, checkbox exercise. In complexity, you start valuing diversity, because if you think about a jungle has biodiversity. If it starts losing its biodiversity, it loses its resilience. And the same is true in a human system. If we don't have people who think differently, if the context around us shifts, we all go down together. You must have heard of the Kodak moment. So if in an organization everything is the same, and there's not a requisite level of diversity, if there's too much diversity, then we tend to have chaos. But there's a requisite level of diversity that enables resilience. And so when you are dealing with a complex system or a wicked problem, one of the best things you can do is to scan more broadly and to bring diverse perspectives into the room, even if it ends up being quite uncomfortable. The next is to embrace provisionality. And the metaphor that I've got up there is a game plan for a rugby game. And the interesting thing here is I sometimes talk about scaffolding as well. Because in a sense, in a complex system, any strategy is provisional. Because you don't know what is going to happen in 3 months, never mind 3 years. The context around us is shifting. I mean, how many of you, even 3 years ago, would have predicted that we would have Brexit, that Trump would be the American president? That, and these are big events. But even just in South Africa, things are so volatile at the moment. And then in an organization, very often at conferences, I ask people, so how many restructurings have you been through in the last, sometimes even 12 months? So the context around us is shifting continuously. And if you understand where complexity comes from, complexity does not reside in the entities themselves. It comes from the interconnectedness, from the connections between things, from the interactions. And as we become more connected, so if you think about things like social media, globalization, all of these things, complexity is increasing. And there's also a statistic now that says that knowledge nowadays is doubling every 12 months. So if you think about that context, the increasing complexity, knowledge, the exponential increase in knowledge, then how can we have a fixed 12 or 3-year strategy? So the idea is that if you see your strategy as a scaffold, as a place to start. So if you think about the All Blacks, for example, they must have a game plan when they run onto the field. But they know that that game plan will need to change the moment they engage with the other team. The same, we also do a lot of, I love researching what's happening in the armed forces because it's the same. Your battle plan only survives your first encounter with the enemy. And I think we need to start holding our strategies a bit more lightly. This is not to say that we shouldn't have them. We must just see them as provisional and put feedback loops in place so that we're able to respond when something shifts. So one of my clients is the National Parks Board, and they have a process called strategic adaptive management. And their fundamental underlying principle, because they manage ecosystems, is that this strategy is going to change. So let's just plan for that up front and put methods in place so that we know when we need to adapt. And this one I thought was quite interesting. How many of you are Lord of the Rings fans? So if you want to take some time reading that, I thought it was quite funny. But the real interesting piece is down there at the bottom. So he says, overwhelm the enemy with vast numbers, that's cool. Fight with your funny-looking sword, hammer thing, that's cool. But wearing your ring of power on the outside of your armor. So this, for me, is a very good example of beware of unintended consequences. Because this is the other thing in a complex system, is sometimes the things that we do have the complete opposite effect of what we wanted them to do. And one of the areas in especially corporates where we find a lot of this is when it comes to how we incentivize people and the things that we choose to measure or the targets that we set. Because often we would say, for example, we want more collaboration, we want more teamwork, but then the way that we measure performance is individual. Or we would say to many of my clients, I don't know if this rings a bell for any of you, want to become more customer-centric. client centricity. That's a big buzzword at the moment. So that is the strategy. That is what they want. We now have a value where we put our clients at the center of everything we do. But a poor call center agent has a target or a measure that they're not allowed to stay on the line with a customer for longer than 2.5 minutes. So when it comes to that 2.5 minute mark, and you are the poor call center agent with a difficult client, what do you do? Because now it's is it this value or is it my bonus? And I think you know which one wins. So we really need to be careful. And one of the key things, this goes back to being in the present. It's this idea of we need to be continuously monitoring what impact are my interventions having. Is it the impact I thought it would have? Or is it not having the effect I wanted it to have? And sometimes what's interesting is the things that create a lot of confusion in an organization can be quite small. So remember the butterfly effect? You know, for example, sometimes, so I love metaphors. You'll see I use a lot of metaphors myself. But very often we would have a project, a big change project or a re-engineering project, and we think that we're going to give this project a really interesting name, you know, like nice metaphor. And in one of the companies where I've worked, for example, had a project called Project Jenga. Now, how many of you know what Jenga is? It's a game where so this is an HR project called Project Jenga. And at the same time, there was a big brand migration called Project Serengeti, which kind of makes sense initially when you think about it. Serengeti, it's about migration. But then what happens on that? I mean, what is the first image that comes to mind when you think about that migration? Crocodiles. And so the anti-stories that were circulating in that organization, just because of a name that people thought this would be cute. So this, you know, again, so beware of unintended consequences. I think that is another big one in a complex system. And so we manage, but we manage differently. And I think complexity started coming into the business environment probably about 20 years ago. And back then, one of the key messages or the way that it was presented was the entire world is complex and you can't manage it. You must just deal with the emergence and, you know, go with the flow. And I think that was a bit of a damaging message because you can manage in complexity, but you manage differently. And one of the best analogies that I've ever heard is by my friend Dave Snowden, so I'm going to steal his story. But I want you guys to imagine holding a party for a bunch of 9-year-old children. Can you all imagine that? Have you been through that? Some of you. Okay. 3 times. Oh, so you're the expert. So if you imagine that. So now there are 2 ways that you can go about organizing this party. One is the ordered systems approach. So in that approach, you consult your party best practices before you start the party. And you have ideal party outcomes that is linked to whatever the learning outcomes in your society is at any given moment. When the party starts, you have a PowerPoint presentation where you sit all the kids down and you explain to them how their pocket money is linked to how they respond at this party. The party commences, everything is nicely ordered. At the end of this party, you do an after-action review and you update your party best practice database. Are you familiar with that approach to arranging parties? So the complex systems approach would be, you bring the children together, you draw a line in the sand, and you say to them, you cross that and you die. And then you put out what we call catalysts. So I would put a videotape on, or you'd put a ball outside. You know, you start putting catalysts out there to see if an attractor would form. So I'm starting to use some of the complexity language. But basically what we're trying to do is we are experimenting to see what might work. But we set boundaries. So these experiments are safe to fail. So within boundaries, we try different things and we see if we can stimulate positive patterns. So if a positive pattern of play forms, I'm able to amplify it. If a negative pattern of play forms, like a soccer ball in my living room, I'm able to disrupt or dampen it. But it's a very different way of managing. And I think this is something that, in an organizational context, can add a lot of value when we're dealing with these intractable problems, because many of us nowadays are wanting groups to self-organize. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Agile movement, for example. Self-organization can't be designed. You can't mandate it. All you can do is create the environment where it can emerge. And how you do that is through creating enabling constraints. So these are setting the boundaries and creating some form of an attractor. And the one that typically works the best is just giving a sense of purpose. I think many teams have no idea how what they do fits in with the bigger purpose of the organization. But it's a different way of managing. And I think key here is we need to meet the system where it is. So we're back a little bit to the now. And we need to find the evolutionary potential in the present. Because very often what we do is we meet a system or we interact with a system in the way that we wish it were. If you think about the typical culture change process, for example, it's all about that ideal future culture. We want this wonderful culture, but we disregard where the system is now. And very often these big processes that attempt to close the gap between where we are now and that ideal fail, and then we end up with really cynical systems, where people just think, this is just another one of those things. Whereas if we remain in the present and we can really understand where is the system now. So if, for example, we really want to have an innovative system, but right now it's not. Telling people to be innovative is not going to work. Telling people to think differently. I always think that's so, what does that even mean? But if I can meet the system where it is and I can start doing small things to start creating the environment where innovation can emerge, that is a much more sustainable solution. So I think this idea of meeting the system where it is and not telling it how to be. I think the other thing is when you're faced with an intractable problem, very often, so culture in organizations tend to be a bit of an intractable problem. If you're, for example, if you're in a culture that is very stuck in its ways and there's no innovation, shifting that is a very difficult or a very hard thing to do. And very often what we do is we focus on the people. We would say to people, you need to be different. You need to do these behaviors. You need to think like this. We want to change your mindset. We want to, all of these things. But what we forget about is the system and the processes, the environment we're putting these people in. Because I can teach you how to be more creative, and I can teach you to have a different mindset and all of these things. But if I just send you back into a system where you're still being measured in a certain way, and you're still not allowed to fail, and all of these things haven't shifted, then I was wasting my time. So sometimes making small changes in the environment can actually have a very big impact. But we need to find where is the system ready to evolve. So I don't know how many of you have heard of nudge theory that comes from behavioral economics. We nudge people, but very often that nudge is a yank. So we kind of want to yank them to where we think they should be. So this is the ideal, and I'm going to yank you there. Whereas this is saying, well, where are you ready to be nudged? And maybe it's not taking you all the way where I think you should be, but I can nudge you a little bit and evolve forward slowly. And then this is one of my last slides. I have no idea how I'm doing for time. I hope I'm not over my time yet. So I don't know how many of you have ever heard of elephant paths. But basically there are two ways that I can go about laying out a park. So I can bring in the experts, so the landscape architects, and they can have a look at where's the sun and where's the, what's the helling, the elevation, and all of these things, and then they design where are the beds and flower beds and where must the paths be, and in the end you get that. So the complex systems approach would be, lay the grass first, let the people in, see where they walk, and then you lay your paths where they are naturally walking. And this is very different because we want to design. Design thinking is all the rage at the moment, and it definitely has its place. Because in a complicated system, we can design because we understand what the outcome must be. We know what we don't know, and we know the outcome, so we can design. In a complex system, if we spend too much time designing, we're wasting our time because in the end, we're going to have that. So it's much more of an effective process. And it's often I feel there needs to be a distinction between efficiency and effectiveness, because very often we focus on what is efficient. And if you think about optimization and lean and all of these things, it's all about efficiency. What we're talking about is what is effective. And sometimes experimenting and being a little inefficient is more effective. So I think my final message is just that we are very often nowadays in uncharted territory. If you think about, for example, things like autonomous vehicles. If you think about some of our children will never know what it feels like to finally have the freedom of getting your own driver's license. They won't even know what driving is. And we just live in a world that is changing so quickly that we are very much in uncharted territory. And the idea is that we need a compass because there aren't any maps. And we need to become comfortable with that uncertainty. And I hope that some of the things that I spoke about tonight will just give you a little bit of a hint and some hooks in terms of what it is that makes you effective in uncertainty. So thank you.